As the burly biker's fist connected with the elderly woman's face, she crumpled to the ground, unconscious. He sneered, convinced that someone like her didn't belong in Ironclad Diner. But what he didn't know was who her son was. A man trained for combat, watching in silent horror as his mother collapsed before him. What happened next would shock everyone. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Miriam Lawson, a 75-year-old retired librarian, stepped into Ironclad Diner, gripping her phone as she wrapped up a call with her son Daniel. "Yes, dear, I just arrived," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. "I can't wait to see you. It's been far too long." "I'm looking forward to it too, Mom," Daniel Lawson's voice crackled through the phone. "I should be there in about 15 minutes. Are you sure you'll be okay waiting?" Miriam chuckled softly. "Of course, I may be old, but I'm not helpless. Just drive safely, all right?" "All right, Mom. See you soon. Love you." "Love you too, dear," Miriam said warmly before pressing the end call button. As she lowered her phone, she took a moment to scan the interior of the diner, a place she once knew so well, now barely recognizable. Gone were the cozy booths, checkered tablecloths, and friendly chatter. Instead, the walls were lined with gritty photographs of motorcycle clubs, chrome-plated trophies, and graffiti-style murals. The transformation was stark, and for a moment, Miriam felt like a stranger in a place that once felt like home. As she stepped forward, lost in thought, she didn't notice the large man in a leather vest approaching from the side. Their shoulders bumped, and she stumbled slightly. "Watch it, Grandma," the biker sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "You lost or something? This ain't your kind of place." Miriam steadied herself, smoothing down her cardigan with trembling hands. She looked up at the man, his face twisted in a mocking grin. Despite the sting of his words, she forced herself to remain composed. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be. Please excuse me." The biker scoffed, muttering something under his breath before swaggering back toward his table. Miriam could feel the weight of his glare on her back, along with the curious stares of other patrons who had witnessed the brief exchange. The hostility in the air made her shoulders tense, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. She had come here for one reason, to reunite with her son. Glancing around, Miriam took in the diner's new atmosphere. What was once a welcoming community hub had become a rough, exclusive hangout. She spotted the man she had bumped into earlier sitting with a group of fellow bikers, their laughter loud and boisterous, grating against her nerves. Determined to find a seat, Miriam walked carefully through the space. She finally spotted an empty booth by the window and made her way over, feeling the weight of lingering stares from both customers and staff. The waitresses, dressed in tight skirts and crop tops, eyed her suspiciously. This was no longer the friendly place where she once graded essays over coffee or shared meals with her late husband and children. It felt cold and unwelcoming. As she settled into the booth, her mind drifted back to those happier days. She could almost see the echoes of the past, her husband's gentle smile as he sipped his coffee, her children giggling in the corner after a long day of school. But now, her husband was gone. Her children had moved across different states, building their own lives. The warmth of those memories clashed painfully with the stark reality before her. Despite everything, Miriam refused to let it ruin this moment. She was about to see Daniel, her son, whom she hadn't embraced in years. That thought alone was enough to bring a small smile to her lips. She had endured worse in her lifetime: prejudice, cruelty, and hardship. But today wasn't about the past. Today was about family. Taking a deep breath, she clasped her hands together in her lap and waited, holding on to the hope that her son's arrival would bring a little warmth back into this place that had once meant so much. The diner may have changed, but Miriam Lawson was determined to make the most of this precious time with her son. As she sat in the booth, surrounded by unfamiliar and unwelcoming faces, she held on to the hope that Daniel's arrival would bring back a piece of warmth to this place that had once meant so much to their family. She had been waiting for several minutes, her eyes drifting toward the entrance every so often, eager for the sight of her son. The weight of the ironclad diner's hostile atmosphere pressed down on her, but she refused to let it shake her. The sharp click of heels against the tiled floor interrupted her thoughts. A waitress approached, her bleached blonde hair stacked high, her uniform tight and revealing. There was no warmth in her expression, no welcoming smile like the ones Miriam remembered from years ago. Instead, her face was set in a mask of irritation, as if she had already decided that the elderly woman didn't belong. "You lost or something?" the waitress asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't exactly a place for, well, you know." Miriam sat up straighter, refusing to let the rudeness shake her composure. "No, dear, I'm not lost," she said gently. "I'm waiting for my son. We're meeting here." The waitress arched a skeptical eyebrow. "Right. Well, what do you want while you wait?" "I'd like to see a menu, please," Miriam requested politely. The waitress sighed loudly, exaggerating her frustration. "We don't do paper menus anymore. It's all QR codes now. Or you can read the board behind the counter." Miriam frowned slightly, glancing toward the counter. The board was mounted too high, the letters a blur from where she sat. "I'm afraid I don't know how to scan QR codes, and my eyesight isn't what it used to be. I can't read the board from here." The waitress clicked her tongue, her annoyance clear. "Look, lady, I don't have time for this. Just walk up to the counter if you want to see the menu." Heat rose in Miriam's cheeks, but she remained composed. "I understand you're busy, dear," she said patiently. "But even if I went up to the counter, I still wouldn't be able to read it. My eyes, well, they aren't as good as they used to be." The waitress exhaled sharply, then reached down and snatched Miriam's phone off the table without asking. "Here, I'll scan it for you." The rough way she handled the phone made Miriam flinch, though she said nothing. The young woman tapped the screen impatiently, clearly in no mood to explain what she was doing. Miriam simply watched, feeling a mix of gratitude for the help and sadness at the lack of kindness in the gesture. Technology, meant to make things more convenient, had instead become another barrier, another reminder of how out of place she felt in this new version of her once familiar diner. A moment later, the waitress shoved the phone back onto the table. "There," she said flatly. "Menu's on your screen now." Miriam took the phone carefully, squinting at the small text. She fumbled with the zoom function, trying to make the letters big enough to read. The waitress tapped her foot impatiently. After a few moments, Miriam looked up, a hopeful smile forming. "Do you still serve those delicious orange marmalade muffins? My husband used to love them when we came here." The waitress frowned, looking both confused and annoyed. "Lady, we've never served anything like that. You must be thinking of somewhere else." "Oh, but you did," Miriam said softly, trying to keep her voice kind. "It was years ago, of course, but they were quite popular." "Well, we don't have them now," the waitress snapped. "We've got a limited dessert menu. Bikers aren't big on fancy muffins." Miriam's shoulders sagged slightly, another piece of her cherished memories chipped away. "I see," she murmured. "Well, in that case, I'll just have a simple coffee, please." The waitress rolled her eyes. "Fine. One coffee. Anything else?" Miriam shook her head. Without another word, the waitress turned to leave. As she walked away, she tossed a final parting shot over her shoulder. "Next time, get your eyes checked, Grandma. Might make things easier for everyone." Miriam inhaled slowly, sitting back in her booth. The words stung more than she cared to admit. She thought to herself how hard it seemed for young people these days to show even a modicum of respect for their elders. This place, once a haven of warmth, laughter, and family, now felt cold. And for the first time since stepping through the doors, Miriam wondered if she had made a mistake coming here. Miriam Lawson's hands trembled slightly as she placed her phone back on the table. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that Daniel would be arriving soon. The thought of seeing her son after so long brought a small smile back to her face. She would endure this unpleasantness, she decided. After all, she had faced far worse in her lifetime. As she waited for her coffee, Miriam's mind drifted to happier times in this very diner. She could almost hear the laughter of her children, the warm conversations with her fellow librarians, the gentle teasing of her late husband. The memories were a sharp contrast to the cold hostility surrounding her now, but they gave her strength. Straightening her back, Miriam resolved to face whatever else this changing world had in store for her. with the same grace and dignity she always had. The front door of Ironclad Diner swung open with a creak. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his crisp white Navy officer's uniform immaculate. His very presence commanded attention. Daniel Lawson. He paused just inside the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the transformed interior. For a brief moment, a flicker of confusion crossed his face as he took in the rough, unfamiliar atmosphere of the once-beloved diner from his childhood. But before he could fully process the change, movement caught his attention. Two large men approached. Miriam immediately recognized one of them. It was the biker who had sneered at her earlier. His name, stitched onto his jacket, read Rex. The other man, even larger, had a shaved head and wore a jacket emblazoned with the name Duke. Rex's voice carried across the diner, loud and mocking. "Oh, look at this Duke. Must be her son. Or maybe they're all just blind like she is," he sneered. "Hey, soldier boy, can't you read? This ain't your kind of place." Duke snickered, his eyes scanning Daniel's uniform. "What's with the costume, man? You playing dress up or something?" Daniel inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Years of rigorous military training had instilled in him an unshakable sense of control. He had faced war zones, commanded teams under fire, and seen the worst humanity had to offer. He wouldn't waste his energy on men like these. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, his voice calm and measured, "I assure you, I can read just fine. I'm simply surprised. This place has changed quite a bit since I was last here. Is this still Ironclad Diner?" Rex's grin twisted into a scowl. Clearly, Daniel's composure irritated him. "Yeah, it's still Ironclad, but it ain't for your kind anymore, pretty boy." "I see," Daniel replied neutrally. "Well, as paying customers, my mother and I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Duke stepped closer, his massive frame looming. "Yeah? Well, we'll see how much fun you have here," he muttered. "We'll make sure of it." As Daniel and Duke locked eyes, Rex leaned in, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "This isn't over, soldier boy. Not by a long shot." The two bikers stepped back, retreating to their seats, but the tension in the air remained thick, the unspoken threat lingering between them. Daniel stayed rooted in place, his instincts at war with his discipline. He knew he could handle them if it came down to it. But he was also keenly aware of the consequences of a physical confrontation, especially in uniform. Just as the situation seemed ready to boil over, a voice broke through the tension. "Daniel, Daniel, dear." His mother's voice. The moment he heard it, everything else faded. Turning his head, Daniel spotted Miriam, sitting by the window, waving him over. Her face was alight with joy and relief, a warm smile standing in stark contrast to the harshness of the room. Without hesitation, he strode toward her. He could feel the weight of every stare on his back, but none of it mattered, because after 8 long years apart, he was finally here. With her. "Mom," he said softly, reaching the booth. He leaned down, wrapping his arms around her in a firm, protective embrace. And for the first time since stepping into this diner, he felt truly at home. The familiar scent of her perfume wrapped around Daniel, pulling him back to childhood memories. Quiet evenings with his mother reading to him, the warmth of her hugs after a long day. For a brief moment, the tension of the past few minutes faded away. Miriam Lawson held her son tightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's so good to see you, my boy." As they pulled apart, Daniel slid into the booth across from his mother, taking in every detail of her face. She looked older than he remembered. Lines deeper, hair more silver, but her smile was just as warm as ever, a beacon of love in this cold, unwelcoming place. "I saw they gave you a hard time," Miriam said, her voice tinged with concern. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Nothing I can't handle, Mom." "Did those men trouble you too?" She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "As you might have guessed," she admitted. "But I've lived through worse. You know, I've heard comments like that my whole life. It's sad that people still think that way, as if they've learned nothing." Daniel reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry you had to go through that again, Mom." Miriam squeezed his hand, her expression firm with quiet strength. "No, my dear, we shouldn't waste our time worrying about people like that. Let's enjoy this moment together. It's been far too long, and I want to hear all about your life in the Navy." As mother and son settled into conversation, the weight of the diner's hostile atmosphere seemed to fade. The low murmur of bikers in the background, the lingering stares, it all blurred into insignificance. In this booth, in this moment, they were just a mother and son, reunited after years apart. Miriam's eyes sparkled with pride as she took in her son's crisp Navy officer's uniform, the very image of dedication and discipline. "Look at you," she said with admiration. "Every inch the naval officer. Your father would have been so proud to see you like this." At the mention of his father, Daniel's expression softened. "I think about him every day," he admitted. "Especially when I'm on duty. I hope I'm living up to his expectations." Miriam's gaze was tender as she reached across to pat his hand. "Oh, my dear boy, you far exceeded them. I have no doubt." Their moment was interrupted as the waitress approached, her demeanor as cold as before. Daniel noticed immediately the disinterest in her expression, the way she barely acknowledged them. "Could I get a beer, please?" Daniel asked politely. "I'm off duty," he added, almost as an afterthought. The waitress gave a curt nod and turned to leave without so much as a glance at Miriam. "Excuse me," Miriam called after her, her voice polite but firm. "I ordered a coffee quite some time ago, but it still hasn't arrived." The waitress turned back, her face a mixture of annoyance and indifference. "I'll bring both drinks together," she said flatly before walking away. Daniel's brow furrowed as he watched her go. "Has the service always been like this?" he asked. Turning back to his mother, Miriam sighed, shaking her head. "Not at all. This place, it's changed so much." She glanced around, sadness flickering in her expression. "Do you remember how it used to be?" Daniel's eyes swept over the walls covered in biker memorabilia, the rough crowd that filled the space. "I can hardly believe this is the same place," he murmured. "Remember the bowling alley in the back?" he added. "Sarah, Mark, and I used to beg Dad to let us play after dinner." A wistful smile touched Miriam's lips. "Oh yes, and your father would always give in, even though we both knew you'd be too wound up for bedtime afterward. And you'd sit right here," Daniel continued, tapping the table, grading papers while we played. Miriam nodded, her eyes misting over with memories. Those were such happy times. As they reminisced, the warm nostalgia was slowly overshadowed by an unsettling feeling. They could feel it, the weight of hostile stares from across the room. The bikers from earlier, Rex and Duke, sat at their table, watching them intently, their expressions dark and threatening. Miriam shifted uncomfortably in her seat, lowering her voice. "Perhaps we should go somewhere else, Daniel. I don't think we're very welcome here." Daniel's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. "No, Mom," he said firmly. "We have every right to be here. We're paying customers, just like anyone else. And this place, it holds special memories for us. We shouldn't let them drive us away." Miriam studied her son's face. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the same strength his father had. And despite the fear twisting in her chest, a flicker of pride swelled inside her. He was right. They weren't going anywhere. The mention of her late husband stirred something deep inside Miriam Lawson. As she looked at her son, standing firm in his conviction, she saw so much of his father in him. A surge of pride welled up in her chest. "You're right, of course," she admitted softly. "It's just hard to see a place that once meant so much to us change like this." "I know, Mom," Daniel said gently. "But we're here now. Together. Let's make the most of it." Just then, the waitress returned, setting their drinks on the table without a word before disappearing as quickly as she had come. Daniel picked up his beer and raised it slightly. "To family," he said, his voice warm. "And to memories, both old and new." Miriam lifted her coffee, clinking her cup gently against his bottle. "To family," she echoed. For the first time since stepping into the ironclad diner, her smile felt genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. They sipped their drinks, letting the moment settle. Despite the unwelcoming air around them, they found comfort in each other's presence. The years apart had done nothing to weaken the bond between them. After a few moments of easy conversation, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Mom, I've got some news," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Miriam set her cup down, curiosity flickering across her face. "Oh, what is it?" A small smile played at Daniel's lips. "I've recently been promoted in the Navy. I'm now a lieutenant commander." Her eyes widened in delight. "Oh, Daniel, that's wonderful news," she beamed at him, pride clear in every word. But as she leaned forward in excitement, the harsh overhead lighting caught her face at just the right angle. And Daniel noticed something. His expression changed in an instant, his joy replaced by concern. "Mom," he said, his voice careful but serious. "Your eyes? Is that a cataract I'm seeing?" Miriam's smile faltered for the first time. Instinctively, she blinked and looked away. "Oh, you noticed that, did you?" she said lightly, but there was something strained in her voice. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I'm afraid so. It's been developing in my left eye for a while now." Daniel's brow furrowed. He leaned in, his military instincts kicking in, assessing the situation, searching for a solution. "Why didn't you tell me? How bad is it?" Miriam sighed, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "It's manageable for now," she admitted, "but I won't lie, it's making daily life harder. Living alone, well, it's not as easy as it used to be." Daniel reached across the table again, taking her hand in his. "Mom, you don't have to struggle alone," he said firmly. "I can help cover the medical treatment. We'll get this taken care of." Miriam squeezed his hand gratefully, but there was a hesitance in her eyes. "That's very kind of you, dear," she said gently. "But it's not just about the money. The doctors, they're not sure if surgery is the best option at my age." Daniel's frown deepened. "What do you mean? Surely they can do something." "They can," Miriam nodded. "But there are risks. Recovery isn't as simple for someone my age. The doctors said they'd monitor it for now, but, well, it's not a straightforward decision." A heavy silence settled between them. The background noise of the diner faded into nothing as Daniel studied his mother's face. He noticed the additional lines of worry that hadn't been visible in their video calls. For the first time, it truly hit him how much she had been dealing with on her own. "You know," Miriam said softly, her voice wistful, "I sometimes wish your brothers would take more of an interest in my care." Daniel's chest tightened at her words. "I understand," she continued. "You have your military duties. It makes sense that you live far away. But the others," she hesitated, her voice dropping slightly, "they barely call once a year." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He had dedicated so much of himself to his career, to serving his country, that he hadn't fully considered the weight of his absence, or his brother's absence, in her life. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I promise you, we're going to figure this out. I'll talk to Mark and David. We'll make sure you're taken care of, whether it's for the cataract or anything else you need." Miriam smiled at him, touched by his concern. "You're a good boy, Daniel, just like your father." But before he could respond, she reached out and patted his hand. "But don't worry too much about me," she added. "I've managed this long, haven't I?" Daniel shook his head, unwilling to let the matter drop. "You shouldn't have to just manage, Mom. You deserve better than that, and we'll make it happen. I promise." The conversation had turned somber, the weight of unspoken family dynamics and the challenges of aging alone settling over their booth. After a moment, Miriam placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Excuse me for a moment, dear," she said softly. "I need to freshen up a bit." Daniel nodded, concern still evident in his eyes as he watched his mother carefully navigate her way through the crowded diner toward the restrooms. Her steps were slow, measured, deliberate, and as she disappeared behind the restroom door, Daniel exhaled, his mind already racing with thoughts of how to help her. He had spent his life fighting battles overseas. Now, he realized, his most important battle was right here at home. The restroom was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the rowdy energy of the bikers outside. Inside, Miriam Lawson leaned against the sink, gripping its cool porcelain edge. She stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror, the harsh fluorescent lighting casting deep shadows across her face. Every wrinkle, every silver strand in her hair stood out in sharp relief. She saw a woman who had lived a full life, a woman who had endured, but also a woman who was beginning to feel the weight of time. She turned on the faucet, letting the water run cool against her fingertips before splashing it onto her face. The sensation was grounding, momentarily washing away the heaviness in her chest. Her thoughts drifted. Yes, Daniel was here. That was something to be grateful for. But what about Mark and David? Would she ever see all three of her boys together again before her eyesight failed completely? Or worse? She shook her head sharply, forcing away the creeping thoughts. No, she whispered to herself, straightening her cardigan with steady hands. No use being melancholy. Enjoy this moment with your son. Taking a deep breath, she turned toward the door. But as soon as she stepped out, she stopped cold. A wall of leather and denim blocked her path. Rex, Duke, and several other bikers. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions unreadable, their presence suffocating. Well, well, Rex sneered, his voice thick with mock politeness. Look who we have here. The old lady who thinks she can walk into our place like she belongs here. Miriam's heart pounded, but she kept her posture straight, her composure unwavering. Excuse me, gentlemen, she said calmly. I'd like to return to my son. Duke stepped forward, towering over her, his massive frame blocking even more of the dimly lit hallway. Your son? He scoffed. You mean that loser in the uniform? What's he trying to prove, anyway? Laughter erupted from the group, cruel and mocking. A slow, simmering anger rose in Miriam's chest. She had spent a lifetime dealing with rudeness, with cruelty, with the kind of men who thought they could intimidate her into silence. But hearing them insult Daniel, her son, who had dedicated his life to serving his country, was more than she could bear. Her chin lifted. You should all be ashamed of yourselves, she said, her voice steady and clear. My son is a better man than any of you will ever be. While he serves and protects, you sit here, bullying old women and pretending that makes you important. The smirks vanished. A flicker of something dangerous passed through Rex's eyes. Miriam tried to step past them, but before she could, a large, rough hand clamped around her arm. The grip was tight, cruel. What did you just say to me, you old hag? Rex growled. Pain shot through her arm, but she refused to flinch. How dare your kind disrespect me, he snarled. And then, before she even realized she was doing it, she slapped him. The sharp crack echoed through the suddenly silent diner. For a moment, everything stopped. Eyes widened, mouths hung open. No one could quite believe what had just happened. Then, with a roar of anger, Rex retaliated, his fist connected with her face. The force sent Miriam crashing to the cold tile floor. Pain exploded across her cheek, her nose, her ribs as she hit the ground hard. A warm trickle of blood ran down her face, and the world around her blurred. Dazed, ears ringing, she barely registered the laughter of the men above her. And in that moment, only one thought cut through the pain. Daniel. She prayed he wouldn't do anything reckless. But across the diner, Daniel Lawson's head snapped up. His mother's voice, weak, filled with pain, pierced through the noise like a blade. And then he saw her, lying on the floor, blood on her face. The world around him went silent. His body moved before his mind could even process. A blur of motion, a single focus. Protect her. Mom. His voice rang out, sharp and commanding. The bikers turned, just in time to see him charging. In one fluid motion honed by years of training, Daniel tackled Rex and Duke, bringing both larger men crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted. The diner filled with the sound of tables scraping, gasps of shock, and the stunned yells of the bikers as the Navy officer took them down in seconds. Pinned beneath Daniel, Rex struggled, his eyes wide in disbelief. A fist hovered above him, ready to strike, and for a brief electric second, Daniel nearly let it fall. But then, a voice in his head. Years of discipline. A lifetime of knowing that control was the most powerful weapon of all. His muscles tensed, his mind raced, and Daniel Lawson made a choice. A voice echoed in Daniel's head. Discipline, control, restraint. He was a Navy officer. His actions didn't just represent himself, they reflected the entire United States military. Any violence on his part, no matter how justified it felt, could have severe repercussions. That brief hesitation was all the bikers needed. Rough hands grabbed him, yanking him off Rex and Duke. Suddenly, Daniel found himself surrounded. Men closed in from all sides, their faces twisted with rage. You're dead, pretty boy, one of them snarled, his face inches from Daniel's. Nobody touches our leader and walks away. But Daniel didn't flinch. Even outnumbered, even in danger, he held his ground. His military training gave him an unshakable presence, his breathing steady, his mind calculating. Your leader, Daniel said, his voice low and controlled, just assaulted an elderly woman, my mother. If anyone should be worried, it's him. A ripple of uncertainty flickered through the crowd. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Rex, now back on his feet, pushed through his circle of men, rage darkening his bruised face. "You've got some nerve, boy," he spat. "Do you even know who we are? What we can do to you? And your precious mommy?" Before Daniel could respond, a weak voice cut through the tension. "Daniel, Daniel, dear." Immediately, his focus shifted. Ignoring the biker's threats, he shoved past them and knelt beside his mother. Blood streaked Miriam's face, a dark bruise already forming on her cheek. But despite the pain, she held her dignity. "I'm okay, son," she whispered, barely above a breath. "Help me up, please. I need to clean myself up." With gentle hands, Daniel helped her to her feet, his arm protectively around her. "Mom, we need to get you to a hospital," he said, his voice thick with concern. But Miriam shook her head. No, she insisted, her voice weak but firm. "I'll be fine. Just let me go to the restroom." Reluctantly, Daniel let her go. He watched closely as she made her way toward the back, her steps slow and unsteady. Then he turned, surveying the room. The tension in the diner was suffocating. Other customers, mostly white, sat frozen in their booths, their eyes darting between Daniel and the bikers. Some looked away when he met their gaze. Others pretended not to notice at all. The waitress, the same one who had treated Miriam with such coldness earlier, was now on the phone, calling the police. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a surge of relief. Finally, justice. But then he saw it. Rex and Duke exchanging glances. A smirk, a silent understanding. And just like that, Daniel's stomach sank. He knew what was coming. The cafe door burst open. 2 police officers stormed in, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Daniel exhaled, steadying himself. This would all be over soon. He would explain everything. The truth would come out, and his mother would get the justice she deserved. But as the officers approached, he saw Rex step forward. And Daniel knew. He knew before the words were even spoken. "Officer, thank God you're here," Rex said, clutching his ribs as if in pain. His voice was thick with false concern. "That drunk soldier attacked me and my friend out of nowhere. We were just minding our own business when he went crazy." A calculated pause. A glance at the blood on Daniel's uniform. The overturned chairs, the bruises on the bikers. And just like that, the officers' expressions hardened. Their eyes locked onto Daniel, assessing the scene with suspicion instead of justice. "Sir," one officer said, stepping forward, his grip tightening on his belt, "I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Wait, no, you don't understand." But before he could finish, the officer spun him around. Metal snapped around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, his voice mechanical, detached. But Daniel barely heard him. His eyes were locked on his mother. She had just emerged from the restroom, and the sight before her, her son in handcuffs being led away like a criminal, made her face crumble in horror. "Daniel." Miriam tried to push past the waitress, her hands trembling. "Officers, please, you're making a mistake. My son didn't do anything wrong." But they didn't listen. The bikers had already closed ranks, their expressions smug, their dominance cemented. The other customers remained silent, unwilling, or too afraid to challenge the lie. As Daniel was led toward the exit, he turned back one last time. Through the diner's window, through the flashing red and blue lights of the police car outside, he saw Miriam. Her tear-streaked face, her lips moving in desperate pleas. And the realization hit him. The afternoon that was supposed to be a joyful reunion had turned into a nightmare, and he was powerless to stop it. One of the officers, a younger man with a stern expression, stepped forward holding a breathalyzer. "Sir, we're going to need you to take a breath test," he said, his tone making it clear there was no room for argument. Daniel, his wrists still bound behind his back, nodded solemnly. He had only had one beer. But at this moment, even that felt like a damning piece of evidence against him. As he blew into the device, he caught sight of Rex and Duke standing near the diner entrance, their smug grins etched across their faces. The breathalyzer beeped. The officer checked the reading, his eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to his partner and nodded, a silent confirmation that sealed Daniel's fate. "All right. Into the car," the older officer said, gripping Daniel's shoulder and guiding him toward the patrol vehicle. Just as Daniel was about to be placed into the back seat, a commotion erupted from the diner entrance. Miriam Lawson had broken free from the waitress's hold and was now rushing toward the scene. Her face was a mixture of distress and determination. "Please, officers," she called out, her voice trembling but clear. "You're making a terrible mistake. My son is innocent. He was only trying to protect me." The younger officer turned, his expression softening slightly at the sight of the elderly woman's visible injuries. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," he said, his tone more measured. "But we have multiple witnesses stating that your son instigated the altercation." "That's not true," Miriam protested, her voice rising with frustration. "Those men, they were harassing us. They attacked me. Look at my face." The officers exchanged glances. For the first time, they truly looked at her. The bruising around her eye, the dried blood beneath her nose, the unmistakable signs of violence. A flicker of doubt crossed their faces. But before they could speak, Rex's voice sliced through the tension. "Officers," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "The old lady is confused. She had a bit too much to drink and took a tumble in the bathroom. We were trying to help her when her son went berserk." Miriam's face flushed with anger. "That is a lie," she snapped. "I haven't had a drop of alcohol. Her words were suddenly cut off by the arrival of another police vehicle. A black SUV rolled to a stop beside the patrol car. The door opened and a tall, distinguished-looking officer stepped out. His uniform insignia marked a higher rank. His posture radiated authority. "What's the situation here?" the new arrival asked, scanning the scene. The younger officer began to explain. But then, the senior officer's gaze fell on Daniel. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by confusion. "Wait, Lawson?" Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes widened in shock as he recognized the man standing before him. Captain Ridley? Indeed, it was Captain Marcus Ridley, a high-ranking officer in the Navy, a man who had led multiple overseas missions Daniel had served on. Captain Ridley's sharp gaze flicked between Daniel and the officers, his brows furrowing. "Can someone explain to me," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the air, "why one of the Navy's most decorated officers is in handcuffs?" A hush fell over the scene. The officers stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances. At the diner entrance, Rex and Duke shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the shift in power, Miriam stepped forward. "Officer Ridley, is it?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Please, my son is innocent. Those men," she gestured toward Rex and Duke, "have been harassing us all afternoon. They assaulted me when I stood up to them, and Daniel was only trying to protect me." Captain Ridley's jaw tightened as he took in Miriam's injuries. Then, without hesitation, he turned to the officers. "Remove those handcuffs, now." One of the officers hesitated. "Sir, we were told that." "I don't care what you were told. I know Lieutenant Commander Daniel Lawson, and I know he wouldn't do what you're accusing him of." One of the officers quickly stepped forward and unlocked Daniel's cuffs. The second they fell away, the energy in the ironclad diner shifted. The smug grins on Rex and Duke's faces vanished, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to fear. Miriam immediately moved to her son's side, relief washing over her as she took his free hand in hers. But Daniel's attention remained locked on Rex, who was now pale, his bravado crumbling. Sensing he was losing control of the situation, Rex stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute," he began, his tone defensive. But Captain Ridley cut him off with a sharp look. "Sir, I suggest you step back and remain silent," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "We're going to sort this out, and I have a feeling," his eyes narrowed, "you're not going to like where it leads." A thick, heavy silence settled over the scene. For the first time since walking into Ironclad Diner, Daniel knew. The tide had turned. Captain Marcus Ridley turned to his fellow officers, his voice steady and commanding. "Take this inside," he ordered, gesturing toward Ironclad Diner. "I want to hear everyone's story, and I mean everyone. No one leaves until we get to the truth." As the group began moving back toward the diner, Daniel Lawson caught his mother's eye. A silent understanding passed between them. The tide had turned, and finally, justice seemed within reach. Inside Ironclad Diner, the usual boisterous energy was gone, the laughter, the dominance of the biker gang, replaced by silence. Patrons, staff, and bikers alike watched with unease as Captain Ridley led Daniel, Miriam, and the officers back inside. His commanding presence filled the room, the weight of his authority pressing down on every soul present. Ridley's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "All right, I want to know exactly what happened here, and I want the truth. Who wants to start?" For a moment, no one spoke. The bikers exchanged nervous glances. The cafe owner and waitress shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. Then Miriam Lawson, still gripping her son's hand, stepped forward. "I'll start, Captain Ridley," she said, her voice steady despite the bruises on her face. She took a breath and told them everything. The hostility from the moment they walked in, the disrespect, the threats, and finally, the attack outside the restroom. As she spoke, Ridley's expression grew increasingly grave. When she finished, he turned to Daniel. "Lieutenant Commander," Ridley said formally. "Do you have anything to add?" Daniel nodded. His military bearing was evident as he spoke. "Sir, everything my mother said is true. I reacted when I saw her injured, but I did not initiate any violence. I was attempting to de-escalate the situation when the police arrived." Ridley turned his attention to the cafe owner and waitress. "And you two?" he said, his gaze piercing. "What did you see?" The owner, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, officer," he muttered, "we don't want any trouble. These bikers, they're our regulars. We can't afford to lose their business." Ridley's eyes narrowed. "So, you were willing to let an innocent woman be assaulted in your establishment?" The waitress, her earlier bravado gone, spoke up hesitantly. "It's true," she admitted, her voice small. We saw everything. The bikers were harassing them from the moment they walked in. We were too scared to do anything." A murmur ran through the crowd. At the back of the diner, Rex, his face flushed with anger, stepped forward. "You can't believe them," he snapped. "We're the victims here. That soldier attacked us." Ridley held up a hand. "Enough." His tone was sharp, silencing Rex mid-sentence. Then, his gaze flicked back to Daniel. "I've known Lieutenant Commander Lawson for years," he said firmly. "We served together in Operation Silent Abyss, a classified mission in the Gulf of Aden. We intercepted and neutralized a pirate group that had hijacked a commercial vessel carrying humanitarian aid. Daniel's actions saved countless lives." A hush fell over the diner. The weight of Ridley's words hung in the air. Several of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. A few regular patrons exchanged guilty looks, suddenly aware of who they had been so quick to judge. Then, a voice spoke up from the back of the diner. "It's true," an older man said, rising from his seat. All eyes turned to him. "I saw everything," he continued. "These bikers have been terrorizing this place for months. What they did to that poor woman, it ain't right. I should have spoken up sooner." His words seemed to break the dam. Other patrons began speaking up, confirming Miriam and Daniel's account. The cafe owner, now seeing the tide turn, hesitated, then approached Ridley. I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "We should have done something. It's just, we were afraid. These guys, they've been running this place like it's their own private club. We didn't know how to stop it." Ridley nodded, his expression stern but not unkind. "I understand fear," he said, "but it's no excuse for allowing innocent people to be harmed. This stops now." Then, turning to the other officers, he pointed directly at Rex and Duke. "And you two," he said, his voice like iron, "are coming with us. Assault, intimidation, false statements to police, you're looking at some serious charges." As the officers moved to apprehend them, several of the other bikers made a dash for the exit. Ridley's voice rang out. "Anyone who leaves now will be considered an accomplice. I suggest you stay and give your statement." The remaining bikers froze. And for the first time since Miriam and Daniel walked into Ironclad Diner, the place felt different. It no longer belonged to Rex and his gang. It was no longer theirs to control. "Anyone who leaves now will be considered an accomplice," Captain Ridley warned. "I suggest you stay and give your statement." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the few bikers who had considered slipping out froze in place. The diner owner hesitated before stepping forward. His face was tight with remorse as he approached Daniel and Miriam. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you both," he said, his voice low. "Please, let me get you some ice for your face, ma'am. Your meals, they're on the house, of course." Miriam nodded graciously, while Daniel kept a protective arm around her shoulders. As the chaos of arrests and statements swirled around them, they found a brief moment to breathe. Daniel turned to his mother, his voice gentle with concern. "Are you okay, Mom?" He reached out, lightly touching the bruising on her face. Miriam managed a small smile. "I'm all right, dear. It's not the first time I've faced prejudice," she admitted, "though I hope it might be the last." She squeezed his hand. "I'm just glad you're safe." As the tension in Ironclad Diner began to fade, Captain Ridley approached them once more. "Daniel, Miriam," he said, his tone sincere. "I'm truly sorry for what you've been through today, but I promise you, these men will face the full extent of the law." He then turned to Miriam, taking in the swelling on her face. "And don't worry about the medical bills," he added. "They'll be covering every penny of your treatment." Miriam nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you, Captain Ridley. You've been a godsend today." Ridley smiled warmly. "Please call me Marcus. Any friend of Daniel's is a friend of mine." Then he gestured toward their booth. "Why don't you two sit down and relax? I'll make sure you're not disturbed any further." As Ridley moved away to oversee the rest of the investigation, Daniel guided his mother back to their table. The diner, once filled with hostility and fear, was slowly transforming. The air of tension was dissipating, replaced by something lighter. Perhaps even the first stirrings of change. Miriam glanced around, her eyes soft as she took in the shifting energy of the space. "You know, Daniel," she said quietly, "I think this place might just become somewhere we can make new memories after all." Daniel gave her hand a squeeze, emotions playing across his face. This afternoon had been nothing like what they had planned. But in facing this adversity together, their bond had only grown stronger. They sat there in silence, sipping their drinks, surrounded by the bustle of justice being served. Mother and son, finally together again. And in that moment, they found peace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Daniel and Miriam finally stepped out of Ironclad Diner. The day's events had left them both physically and emotionally drained. But there was a sense of resolution in the air. Behind them, the diner was alive with activity. Officers were still taking statements, arresting bikers, and gathering evidence. But out here, out in the open, there was only quiet. Daniel kept a steady arm around his mother's shoulders as they walked slowly down the sidewalk. Miriam leaned into his strength, feeling more grateful than she could put into words. For a few moments, they walked in companionable silence, both lost in thought. Then Daniel broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but determined, "I want you to know, I'm going to take care of your cataract treatment. No arguments." Miriam looked up at her son, a mix of gratitude and hesitation flickering in her eyes. "Daniel, that's very generous of you, but—" "No buts, Mom," he interrupted gently. "You took care of me my whole life. It's time I return the favor." Miriam's eyes misted over. She reached out, patted his hand affectionately. "You're a good boy, Daniel," she murmured, "just like your father." They walked a few more steps in silence. Then, for the first time in the entire day, Miriam hesitated. There was something she wanted to say, something she had been afraid to bring up. Daniel noticed immediately. His gaze softened as he looked down at her. "What is it, Mom?" he asked. Miriam took a deep breath, her voice tinged with vulnerability, something Daniel rarely heard from her. "I was wondering, hoping, really, if there might be a way to get all my children together before any treatment or surgery." Daniel stopped walking, turned to face her fully. She continued, her voice quiet but hopeful. "I know it's a lot to ask. Everyone is so busy with their own lives. But—" her voice trailed off. Daniel understood what she wasn't saying. The possibility of complications, the risks of surgery at her age, the fear that she might not have many more chances to see all of them together again. Daniel took her hands in his voice gentle but unwavering. "Mom, listen to me," he said. "I promise you, we're going to make that happen. I'll talk to Mark and David. We'll figure it out." Miriam blinked back tears, and for the first time all day, she felt hopeful. "Whether the doctors approve the surgery or not," Daniel said, his voice firm, "we're going to get everyone together." Miriam's eyes welled with tears at her son's words. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That would mean the world to me." Daniel pulled his mother into a gentle embrace, mindful of her injuries, and in that moment, he felt something shift, a new understanding. For years, he had been so focused on his duty, his career, his missions overseas, that he had never truly considered the weight of what his mother had been going through alone. Her deteriorating eyesight, the loneliness of an empty house, the absence of her children, scattered across different states, caught up in their own lives. Today had given him a new perspective, on her strength, on her resilience, and on what really mattered. As they resumed their walk, Miriam's steps felt a little lighter. You know, she mused, despite everything that happened today, I'm glad we went to the diner. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Really? He asked, genuinely surprised. After all that? She nodded. It reminded me of how strong we are together, she said. And it showed me that there's still good in the world, people willing to stand up for what's right. Daniel smiled, a deep pride swelling in his chest. You're pretty amazing, you know that, Mom? Miriam chuckled softly. Oh, I don't know about that, she said with a playful smirk. I'm just an old lady who's seen a thing or two in her time. They laughed, the sound carrying through the quiet evening, a much-needed release after the tension of the day. As they neared Miriam's home, Daniel made a decision. Mom, he said, his voice resolute, I'm going to stay with you for the next 3 days before I report back to duty. Her face lit up. Really? She asked, hopeful. Yeah, he nodded. We'll use the time to plan the family reunion and get you set up for your medical consultations. Miriam's smile widened at the prospect of spending more time with her son. That would be wonderful, dear, she said. We can finally catch up properly, without any interruptions from unruly bikers. They laughed again, the weight of the day's events slowly melting away. As they reached Miriam's front door, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was a beautiful end to a day that had started with chaos and fear, and ended with hope and resolution. Daniel helped his mother up the front steps, a renewed sense of purpose settling in his chest. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, convincing his brothers to come together, navigating the complexities of her medical care, dealing with the aftermath of today's events. But as he looked at his mother, a woman who had faced adversity her whole life and never let it break her, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face these challenges head-on, and this time forward, she wouldn't have to face them alone.